In the 33 years since Rory Porter's seminal article, The Patient's View, the history of medicine has witnessed a paradigmatic shift towards placing the experiences of patients at the centre of scholarly discourse. The history of psychiatry in particular has been at the forefront of this endeavour. Scholars from a wide range of disciplines have paid an increased attention to the ways in which patients themselves have made sense of their illness and treatment by drawing upon new sources and approaches with which to evaluate them. However, despite this shift towards using alternative sources as a part of a wider attempt to reconstruct a patient-oriented history from below, one significant phenomenon has received surprisingly limited consideration: the Asylum magazine. Despite being a key cultural feature of asylum life in the UK, USA, and Canada from as early as the 1840s, curiously little attention has been paid to patient-produced asylum publications. Scottish institutions were no exception to this burgeoning trend. In fact, they were arguably at the forefront of the phenomenon. Yet, focus on the Asylum magazine in the Scottish context has been positively neglected. Addressing this historiographical gap, this paper examines the dynamics of an important yet overlooked institution within Scotland's history of psychiatry, Dingleton Hospital, through the lens of its in-house magazine Outlook. Shaped by the countercultural influences of the 1960s and an increased interest in the approaches of social psychiatry, this small, unassuming asylum-turned-therapeutic community in the Scottish borders pioneered the development of an innovative approach to mental health care, in which the principles of democracy, openness, and permissiveness were applied within an institutional setting, thus disrupting the long-established boundaries, physical and symbolic, of its former 19th-century asylum structure. Focusing on the theme of boundaries, I will explore the ways in which the notions of self, other, and identity were replicated in the hospital's changing social and spatial structures during this transformative period in Dingleton's history. Through a close analysis primarily of patient writings published in Outlook from 1963, I ask, were the boundaries of identity and space truly tested at Dingleton? Did the liberal rhetoric of Dingleton's advocates match the expressions of lived experience within the therapeutic community? Or was it merely another form of control, a simple reconfiguration of power relationships without any depth and change? By addressing these questions, I hope to show that just as the popular image of the Victorian asylum as a bounded, isolated entity is questionable, so too is the conception of the therapeutic community as a model without boundaries. From the 20th century, we see once again that the boundaries between asylum and community are vague and uncertain. Melrose District Asylum was founded in 1872 as a purpose-built institution specifically designed to care for the pauper insane living in the Scottish border counties of Roxburgh, Selkirk and Berwick. The asylum was renamed Dingleton Hospital in 1948 and in the immediate post-war years underwent a significant transformation under newly appointed Medical Superintendent Dr. George Bell. Contending that the reasons that patients were dangerous was because they were locked up, Bell argued that the only way to obtain security in a mental hospital and in surrounding the community was to open all doors and leave them open. And he did exactly that. Throwing away the keys, Bell established Dingleton as Scotland's first open-door psychiatric hospital, and quickly the hospital acquired a reputation as a leading example of the open-door policies which were adopted by a number of mental hospitals in the UK in the late 1940s and early 50s. However, it was under the superintendency of social psychiatrist Dr. Maxwell Jones during the considerable cultural and social changes of the 1960s that Dingleton truly earned its status and international recognition as a pioneer within mental health care reform. As Jones reminisced in his book, The Process of Change, when he arrived as medical superintendent in 1962, he found a hierarchical structure, a feudal culture in which his predecessor, Bell, and the matron had both perceived their roles in terms of status and authority. Under Jones' management, such structures were drastically altered through its transformation into a therapeutic community. This transformation involved a flattening of institutional hierarchies, experiments in integration and freedom of movement, the introduction of new therapies, and new concepts of responsibility, feedback, and constructive criticism, designed to assist patients into transitioning into adjusted, rehabilitated individuals who would return to life in the community. By the late 1960s and early 70s, the rise of the anti-psychiatry and countercultural movements had significantly influenced the contours of the therapeutic community model. Dingleton, Jones claimed, was developing its own counterculture. It was within this zeitgeist of revolution and reform that in 1963, Outlook's inaugural issue was released, becoming both a product and a facilitator of the therapeutic community context from which it stemmed. One of the main principles underpinning the therapeutic community was an emphasis on the permeability of the hospital's boundaries and the world beyond its gates. And it is clear that although Outlook was produced within an institutional context, it was not a publication that existed in its own cultural bubble. While much of its content relates to the everyday life in the therapeutic community, the abundance of contributions, including poetry, letters, and articles submitted from other hospitals, therapeutic communities, and interested parties, highlights Outlook's position within a wider cultural network. Outlook, therefore, appears as a literary space in which the boundaries between Dingleton's internal world and the social world beyond its walls were transgressed, forming an imagined community that connected not only local groups, families, patients, and staff, but a network of those interested in the therapeutic community movement across the UK and further afield. The boundaries of the hospital and community, however, were not breached only literarily. Outlook's narratives point to the blurring of spatial boundaries and the freedom of movement experienced in the lived reality of the therapeutic community. Numerous articles discuss the frequency with which visitors seeped into Dingleton's grounds and with which patients went out. Patients' reports from group holidays to Butlins, hospital exchanges, trips to nearby towns, theatres, and in cinemas is demonstrative of the fact that patients were not merely confined to spaces designated to madness. The most significant impact upon the patient experience, however, arguably came with the shifting of spatial boundaries within the walls of the hospital itself. Although already operating an open-door system, the built environment upon Jones's arrival remained one premise on segregation. Staff and patients generally did not mix in the same spaces, and wards were segregated by sex. Experiments in integration, therefore, were implemented, underpinned by the belief in the importance of social relationships and living learning situations, which it was felt could be fostered through a spatial environment that encouraged inclusivity and communality. Spatial boundaries within the hospital, therefore, had to be reconfigured and new integrated spaces established. The transformation of the built environment of the hospital was one of Outlook's first comments in its inaugural edition. The significance of such changes was certainly much deeper than a case of mere aesthetics. For example, a canteen and a dining room which was to be shared by staff and patients was established in 1963. From the patient's perspective, it is clear that the canteen was a welcome addition and a valued space, as demonstrated by patient WR's poem, The Canteen Hurrah. The hurrah of the canteens described by WR is supported by a number of articles by patients, who paint the space as a social centre, an enjoyable place of respite and refreshment, of mixing and sociability amongst patient groups, staff and visitors. However, while new spaces like the canteen were welcomed by staff and patients, the desegregation of wards by sex and the implementation of a mixed lounge proved more controversial. From the staff's point of view, the breach of spatial boundaries between male and female patients and between patients and staff seems to have caused particular concern, especially in relation to the hospital's policy of permissiveness, which, although intended to encourage a greater tolerance of individuals' views and behaviour, was taken in some parts to mean sexual freedom. However, the anxiety provoked by integration and the blurring of spatial boundaries was not experienced solely by those traditionally in a position of power. Paradoxically, integration and greater communal mixing resulted in an atmosphere where increased contact between staff and patients, which was intended to improve social relationships, also encroached on patients' sense of privacy. The blurring of spatial boundaries and the increased opportunity for observation, in turn, this meant that there was greater intervention in patients' everyday lives. As a result, patients carved out exclusive spaces for themselves, such as the smoking corridor, which they used to escape the formal life of the hospital. By marking its boundaries, patients exposed established power relations by reversing them, and in doing so, they were able to assert control over their own identities. The existence of the smoking corridor thus throws into question the image of Dingleton as a community without boundaries. For ironically, it was patients, in spite of the discourse of freedom and permeability, who constructed their own geography of exclusion. The creation of geographies of exclusion is indicative of how the borders between self and other are echoed in spatial boundaries. Indeed, the overhaul in institutional structures and the integration of spaces at Dingleton was fundamentally linked to the issue of identity. Influenced by an emphasis on the elimination of physical and symbolic boundaries of difference, the flattening of hierarchical social structures of the hospital community was espoused as a levelling force, which was intended to encourage staff and patients to identify with one another as humans, as people. The replacement of authoritarianism with ideals of democracy, egalitarianism, and communal responsibility clearly had a significant impact on the dynamics of lived experience at Dingleton, for the question of individual roles and identity are the most recurrent themes within Outlook's pages, especially by its patient writers. The example of the centrality of role-blurring formation and the formation of alternative identities as part of establishing a new culture at Dingleton is exemplified in a poem called Acculturation. Here the reader is taken on a journey of identity formation through the various stages of the therapeutic community treatment process, in which the rhetorical questions of who is patient and who is staff draws attention to the role-blurring aspect of the therapeutic community endeavour. However, while the overwhelming majority of articles in Outlook emphasise the relationship between roles, status, and equality in a rather cheery tone, the ways in which these seemingly liberal principles played out in the dynamics of the staff-patient relationships was more complex in practice. As Jones noted, with the hierarchical structure of the hospital threatened, understandably, leaders were found to protect the status quo. Hints of the reassertion of staff power is evident throughout the pages of Outlook. For instance, a poem entitled Question Mark and authored under the pseudonym Nurse Law questions the concept of democracy at Dingleton, asking, if this is a democracy and all the men are brothers, why then are there rules for some and nothing for others? It is in articles relating to the introduction of group therapy, however, that the politics of power and identity most clearly play out. Group meetings are frequently described as frustrating or pointless, as sites in which words become entangled, constructing not a bridge but a barrier. EGS's poem Misinterpretation suggests that there was a hypocrisy to the therapeutic community principle of free speech, for while in theory patients were encouraged to speak their minds, their words were often misinterpreted or ignored. The dynamic described in these patient writings suggests that a very far-reaching exercise of power lay beneath the surface liberality of the therapeutic community movement. Indeed, it appears that in Dingleton's therapeutic community experiment, when more explicit structures of control were overhauled, group therapy became a method in which more psychological form of control could be reasserted. The same could also be said for work therapy at Dingleton. While views and articles and poetry by patients published within Outlook support the notion that work could provide a meaningful way for patients to build confidence and to assume an identity other than that of patient, it is also evident that not everyone experienced work as therapeutic. A sense of the imbalance of power and mistreatment experienced by patients is epitomised by P.O.'s article entitled Treatment, in which he controversially challenges the notion of work as the true answer to normality, the key to saneness, by comparing the principle of work as freedom to labour at a concentration camp. P.O. questions the very basis of work as therapy as a cure for mental illness. However, he goes further in his concentration camp comparison to draw attention to the exploitative nature of the work patients are expected to participate in at Dingleton. They are not engaged in skilled occupations, but channeled into unskilled, low-paid labour. Here, P.O., like many patient writers, holds up the mirror to the logic of sane society, challenging the discourse of the normal and its right to be the objective mouthpiece of the times. Surely it is those who insist on the performance of menial tasks for little to no pay who are mad. It is clear for P.O. and for many other patients, work therapy focused on work at the expense of therapy. A role intended to provide patients with an alternative identity to that of patient, paradoxically served to reinforce their position as a subordinate other. The boundaries of madness were reconfigured and reconfirmed. As the more critical writings published in Outlook suggest, the off-cited perception of Dingleton as a progressive and enlightened institution through its implementation of novel therapeutics must be approached with an element of caution. A close reading of the magazine draws attention to stark continuities in the therapeutic approaches of past eras, echoing the principles of 19th-century moral treatment. Moreover, while the advent of open doors and therapeutic community policies advocated a more humane and less custodial approach to treating mental illness, the subtleties of social control and the imbalance of power inherent in the treatment of those deemed mentally ill remained a pertinent, albeit less explicit feature of psychiatric care. To view Dingleton's unique transition from asylum to open door hospital, however, and then to therapeutic community, in such pessimistic terms would be to obscure its historical significance and influence upon later trends in Scottish mental health care. Evolving into an amalgamation of therapeutic community practices within an institutional setting, Dingleton provided a mixed economy of welfare that straddled the boundary between the traditional asylum care of the 19th century and the community care models of the 20th. This unique structure persisted in the Scottish borders until Dingleton's closure in 2001. Thus, Dingleton not only witnessed considerable longevity, but also provided a blueprint for the development of the primary care models that came to characterise mental health policy in the 1990s. The tale of Dingleton's therapeutic community, as told through Outlook's pages, is thus a significant, yet unheard story, one that should be given the due attention it deserves. Thank you.
First hand up over there.
Thank you, that was really interesting. One of the most striking things was the poetry, where the patients offered sort of support to write those kind of poems, because they were very powerful.
As far as I'm aware, yes, there was a lot of support. It was a very collaborative project, Outlook. And I actually discussed with one of the staff nurses that used to work there how much patient involvement there was, and he said that, in his opinion, it was 75% patient-produced and 25% support from staff members. And that's everything from writing, being encouraged to contribute, to kind of actually putting the magazine together, because I haven't got any photos, but they actually kind of spent time in occupational therapy sewing kind of pieces of paper together to make the original documents. So it was very much a patient kind of led endeavour at the therapeutic community.
Who's next? Yes.
Thank you very much. Again, I enjoyed that very much. There was quite a lot of criticism in the poetry that was there. What happened after it was written? Was that followed up, or did people just say, well, that's got that off their chest, let's carry on?
One of the purposes of the magazine was actually to be purposely critical. It was meant to be a space for patients to be able to voice their criticisms. As far as I'm aware from the other materials that I've read, I don't know much about how it was followed up. But one of the purposes of the magazine was for that to then generate conversation that could be had in groups or within the community between various community members. And it was kind of meant to be something that generated those conversations within what Jones called living learning situations. So if anything critical did come up, it's possible that it was discussed at some other point within the community.
Your thesis begins in 1845, I noticed, and I wondered, how do magazines like this compare with the sort of earlier generation of asylum magazines?
They're quite different, but there are some very uncanny similarities in terms of the things that patients, kind of what their grievances are and what they tend to be critical about. And quite often it is not being listened to. That seems to be the most significant kind of recurring theme. In terms of patient involvement, Dingleton's unique. We have other 19th century asylum magazines such as the Morningside Mirror, which there was a significant amount of patient involvement, but of a very specific type of patient and class of patient. So Dingleton's very unique in the sense that it was a very kind of collaborative, and pretty much all patients were involved with it.
Great. Well, yeah, two more here. Chap back first, and then the chap further forward. Sorry.
Did the democratic regime produce better therapeutic outcomes? I mean, are there comparisons with other hospitals that weren't doing this?
I read a paper that was produced fairly close to the time, and it was reviewing the kind of the principles that were put in place, and it actually did show that Dingleton was a leader in producing better recovery outcomes. I've only seen one paper that has made that argument. I haven't seen any other papers that have said otherwise. But I got an impression that this was something quite significant happening. I'm not sure about other therapeutic communities, but certainly at Dingleton it seemed to be making quite a big impact and that was felt very much within the local community of Melrose as well.
Unfortunately, I was going to ask a question about outcomes, but I was beaten on the draw. But I'm interested on staff attitudes to this, because not only is it a significant change for patients, it's actually very dramatic given how asylums were run in these times. Was there any serious kind of kickback, difficulties with staff actually going along with this philosophy?
From what I've kind of researched, there were a select few kind of long-term staff members that actually left once the therapeutic community was put in place. I think also Maxwell Jones was quite a charismatic but also controversial character, and that kind of led to kind of a few staff members leaving. Generally, it seems to, initially when it was first put in place, there was kind of a lot of criticism. However, it seems that after a few months of kind of getting used to it, that a lot of people actually were fairly on board with it. There are a few kind of patient-produced articles within Outlook that would suggest that maybe there were kind of other ways that staff nurses, for example, wanted to kind of really embed their authority that they had felt had been taken away. But otherwise, it seems to have been particularly well received by that community. So I hope that answers the question.
Great. One more and then we better move on.
One, two. Yeah, that's fine. I wonder how this new regime of openness interacted at the time with the administration of drugs.
There's quite a lot of discussion, I think, at the time about the sex, drugs, and rock and roll image, and that Dingleton acquired a bit of a reputation, especially in Edinburgh, as being a bit too radical, and people in Edinburgh, and kind of in psychiatry, and indeed the people funding it, weren't very happy about it. The extent to which those rumours were true is questionable. I think there was a lot of kind of experiments with LSD, for example, but the extent to which kind of I think they got given an image rather than it actually necessarily being the case. But it was certainly tied up in kind of the countercultural, more radical experiments.
So I meant more in terms of the administration of drugs by the doctors administrating the hospital, in terms of psychotropic.
Okay. There was use of psychotropic drugs, but emphasis was always very much on not using drugs. I think that in very severe cases they were used, but otherwise it wasn't. Recreational drugs seemed to be a bit of a blurry area. The administration of it wasn't a major feature at all, no.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. Thanks.